Hello everyone, today we talk about late antiquity again. I swear it's just out of random topic picking, following my cycles and the wheel of fortune that I employ to in fact take the decision. But I am of course glad to talk about this period as an era on its own, and today we talk specifically of late antique Italy and the period going essentially from the deposition of Romulus Augustus to the rise to power of Theodoric the Great. Recently I made other videos about late antiquity. We talked about Ostrogothic Italy. There are plenty of videos also on actually I think this very passage, right? We made videos also from the other side. I mean the Byzantine one. We talked about Zeno, so you can always check say that this mountain of content that at this point is worth the name. There aren't just the videos I make every day. There is a huge amount of videos that I made over the years about all these topics and now start really thickening the net of each other, getting ever more intertwined, and I'm glad when I can get a bit more in depth with each one, right, in a systemic and hierarchical perspective. So most of today's video is to properly quantify, as we do for most history actually, the properly the dimension of continuity and transformation of, in this case, late antique Italy, because as you know, the concept of the fall of the West, or of the Roman Empire even, is something that has been, in my opinion, masochistically and self-sabotagingly been around, in fact, in the West ever since we began to abandon properly the original meaning of these times and places, and that deserves much greater consideration. So we start from the negative, right? What is that had been declining in the Italian peninsula, how late antiquity manifests itself. Then we pass to the idea of the continuity and observe this regime change from Odoacer to Theodoric in the meaning that this has, considering again the fact that the country was not passively leaving these events, but actually was part of a much bigger system that was just trying to keep still the whole thing together in the meanwhile. So late antiquity was, first of all, as we've seen, we defined as a substantially oligarchic system, right? Italy at this point is functioning pretty much the same way it had been in the previous centuries, right? There were essentially some enormous latifundia owned by the greatest Roman aristocracy that throughout all the, especially the coups of the last decades before 476 had remained in place, and that also contributed together with the federati militias that de facto constituted the Italian army at that point, and naturally wanted to enjoy the centralized position in an empire in which, of course, Rome represented the center of still, ideologically, spiritually, culturally, but that in terms of political and military power had naturally shifted towards the east, and specifically in Constantinople. It was evident after Majorianus that the resources of the Italian peninsula altogether, in terms of manpower and material, would have not been enough for another major campaign like the one actually successfully carried out until the Vandalic intervention against the Visigoths, right? It was a time, again, until the 60s of the 5th century in which there was really no, this would be evident even in the way it eventually happened in 476. No sense that there was the end of anything, right? Even of the western half as such. This was a political decision. We will see now. It was taken just without any practical consequence, as far as especially the situation of the peninsula was concerned. However, the world had been somehow contracting. Let's say if we look at the Eurasian resources altogether, that we're talking about a moment of crisis anyway. The Chinese Empire had undergone the same problems of political fragmentation, of somehow sclerotization of a central power that in many ways had become more effectively authoritarian, but that in exactly because of that just embodied the fact that it was doing so because it couldn't control so much like before anymore. And generally speaking, there was a stationary reality, right? We talk about the migration era as, a moment of great upheaval, and surely there were lots of important movements of peoples, as we will see now, also with the Ostrogoths, that had taken advantage, not necessarily even just the hundreds of thousands of the later, in fact, migrations, of which Italy would be the protagonist, with the Goths and the Longobards. But generally speaking, even movements of war bands, right, of murderers, whatever. However, there hadn't been a formal political territorial collapse of the communities that were historically ruling these countries, right? This process of political fragmentation was essentially stemming from the lack of a surplus that could, again, keep the thing together, but that had not to do much with the stability of the local systems. If you look at Italy, at Gaul, at Spain, there had been at this point no significant change. These were the ones the most, together with Africa, the most advanced countries in the West, even where you have the federati settling in these countries. You have actually generally speaking, a stabilization, right? Some fringe areas become more turbulent. Even these powers do not have technically the capacity to maintain compactly together everything even on a regional scale. However, again, late antiquity had been preserving itself. The only exception being Britain, where things had properly gone another direction, not just because the Romans had literally withdrawn their field armies from the island, but because after this, the local communities had begun to redraw consistently and essentially throwing the country in turmoil, the political and social system, right, with a massive fragmentation, essentially a destruction of the latifundia themselves, right, that only eventually favored the hiring and the settlement of the Anglo-Saxons. But again, before the Gothic War, and you know this because we talked about it for a long time, Italy was still intact, right? By the end of the 6th century, Italy looked much more in terms of, unhingement of late antique, at least the latifundia system, etc., similar to Britain, right? Even though things were significantly different in other ways. But it's important to stress the fact that literally nothing had occurred to make anyone believe that anything had fundamentally changed about the fact that this was a Roman land, that the world had always been functioning the same way, that there had been raids, there had been political instability, assassinations of people at the top, but that, again, the country had simply gone on from forever. There was naturally, would be interesting to analyze how, the perceptions that naturally we mostly don't have, and nor we could fully understand of how, the past, right? Not much the days of the empire, but generally speaking, the continuity of time and of societies, etc., were understood in those terms. And again, we have seen how the concept of the imperium was the one still living pretty much everywhere, not just in the Roman world, but far beyond it, as the sole political goal, indicator, value, right, for any people involved in this whole system. Naturally, we're also talking about big countries. I mean, extensively speaking, the main chunks of the empire, we're talking about significant regional scale unitary policies with a statal bureaucratic apparatus, millions of inhabitants, like fundamentally a cohesive culture, society, also fundamentally religion, right? Given that there were Aryans, for example, in Italy, but yet an Aryan people as a whole, like the Goths, had not yet settled there. These were naturally regions of old Christianization. So the profile here, so in terms of political and territorial stability, is quite consistent. Naturally, we will talk about Gaul and Spain in the same way, and compare it also with other regions. And we have often concentrated properly on the nature of the Eastern Roman Empire at this point. It was slightly different from the West, right? It had a more kind of coastal-based power. Say the provinces of the Western Roman Empire had been somehow more territorially and ethnically cohesive, right? Historically, because they weren't born out of a coastal urbanization like the Hellenic, in fact, colonies, right? They were essentially big chunks of fundamentally ethnically homogeneous peoples that had also been part of the empire as such, right? Continentally, territorially. This is an important feature, characteristic. In any case, when we look at late antiquity, we realize that there had been moments, in fact, of crisis. The economy was definitely showing this. For example, the number of occupied rural sites began to fall in the 3rd or even 2nd century AD. Right? Think about the Antonine Plague that some historians today say, well, it was not a big deal. Well, whatever it was, given what at least the nature of it, for such fragile systems like the pre-industrial ones, it was a big deal. We don't have a precise, close, kind of fully clear picture of the entire population dynamics, etc. As I often point out, in Europe we have a traumatic amount of things that we haven't even begun to think they may have existed, that are there to dig, and that are surely much more than what we can see, just surfaced, right? At least for, again, what can be some of the most important monuments remained, but what existed before in terms also of population dynamics in late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages, is not entirely clear at all. There were entire cities that were there, populated, not in crisis, whatever, but that nobody has ever studied. And yes, we're talking about in the heart of the Mediterranean, and in such highly populated places. And this is how few we actually know about our own world in many ways. And we hope that in spite of all the vicissitudes, we will gradually be able to dig ever more, respecting also the laws, that the nature of the finds that very often get also treated in different ways depending on the era, and how much aggressive archaeology is just willing to accept, just because there's a bunch of money they've been given, they must find something, and they may even destroy other stuff in the process, because the great classical thing pays more than the early medieval stuff, right? But I frankly propose for archaeologists to break the laws in these ways, and very often even hiding the destruction of some kind of structures they find in between that they don't want to ruin their own excavation to be shot on the spot. Right? I think that there is a moral value for which objectively cultural legacy is more important than human life, and we should stop seeing the meaningless human majority as something worth preserving, as opposed to, the superiority of Western civilization and the power of tradition, right, and of imperial power in all its manifestation. And this picture, however, is still framed by a significant amount, of course, of information regarding the moment of the decline. For example, the agri deserti, as they were called in Latin, so the idea of some country areas that had been abandoned, right, had gone depopulated, becoming a common feature of the landscape, and equally towns losing population. Just the other day, I was talking about the late antique world in the countryside and in the towns. Naturally, the countryside was, as always, until the 20th century, overwhelmingly more populated by scale than the cities, right? So, and when we talk about the Roman Empire as a civilization of cities, this is correct by a relative degree, but of course, the majority, the most important structures were in the countryside at least for the surplus that the city embodied itself, and so we should also focus on that. That is unavoidably also less documented, but in part also because we understand how deeply connected it had been with the country, how much with the city, how much the city had been ruling over the countryside since ever, and how powerful the elites of the empire really were. The construction of urban buildings, I'm talking about public buildings, so the ones that embodied properly the imperial government, as far as they were technically still private, but there was a political hierarchy, right, of offices that were in fact held by the local citizens, right, that made this kind of energetic foundations, donations, just to increase their own clienteles, to display their power, to, in fact, to provide the cities with the infrastructures were needed to attract ever more people there, making more revenues. And that had been, as such, one of the distinguishing characteristics of classical civilization. Dried up, right? In the early 6th century, naturally in a moment in which the decline of the system had gradually increased for whichever reason, pretty much everywhere, and just during the destructions of the Gothic War, where really the thing became self-evident because there was a violent transition. It was recognized that the population of Rome was, of course, much smaller than it had used to be. Cassiodorus, so a man who had properly been grown in the full wake, at least, of the civil service of this public system, in spite of, again, the different times of the past. From his historical awareness, noticed that, quote, the vast numbers of the people of the city of Rome in all times are evidenced by the extensive provinces from which their food supply was drawn, as well as by the wide circuit of their walls, the massive structure of their amphitheater, the marvelous bigness of their public baths, and the enormous multitude of mills which could only have been made for use, not for ornament. So pointing out what they were naturally asking already at the time, because the system had been contracting, most of these infrastructures were not quite used anymore. They lamented, that libraries were not frequented anymore. It was it's interesting to see also how dynamic, more culturally dynamic, in some ways, the actually the Latin West had been, as opposed to, for example, the Hellenistic East, right? The Hellenistic libraries were famously enough shut, right? Nobody entered there except the court literates. In the West, we know that public libraries were frequented quite often. There were public readings. People went there. So Cassiodorus, looking at a city like Rome and looking at all the massive vestiges that naturally at the time were far more intact than the ones that you can still impressively see today in terms of baths, of infrastructures, the market, the etc. Was already aware of the fact that those buildings had not been there because the Romans, had material to waste, right? And just to say, okay, let's build a big thing, right? That thing had been primarily functional to the development and nurturing of a massive amount of people that, by this point, did not exist anymore, right? So today we do not talk about the causes of the contraction, whatever. We will talk about this in another video because, as you know, it's a huge topic. But you can understand, even from today, how you cannot measure things economically or demographically, thinking, well, it's basically that. Most adult people nowadays think that economics is fundamentally the only indicator, because, of course, we're a bunch of disgusting materialists who have been indoctrinated in a rigid, in fact, deterministic kind of delusion for which it's the economy that makes the thing, as if people were detached from that, right? Or the causes were just, it's economics, man, but, all the rest was not fixable through what are fundamentally moral dynamics, right? The economy goes wrong when moral resources are low, right? That's the reason I say why people don't make children, and why people don't learn. It's all one, right? The idea of fixating with materialism, not having children, being ever less educated is the typical indicator of the worthlessness of a human being, right? That's in all the history of civilization, that there has never been a moment in which civilization was skyrocketing, improving, being powerful, whatever, with massive demographic social imbalance, with ignorance, whatever. This didn't happen. At least there was always an elite that had managed to fundamentally discipline the herds of the population into achieving something big and great, and things kept expanding and expanding. Right? Nowadays in the world, we see that every major country, right, including the ones that pretend that they are fighting against the terrible world order that surely has always existed, and especially those ones have the most traumatically shocking level of not just cultural underdevelopment, but literal natality rate, social cohesion, right? The lowest rates of education, literally, and that's the reason why they fail. Because you cannot, if you are underdeveloped people, you cannot properly afford to have a place in the world stage, right? It's automatic. Nobody needs to stop you. I mean, people will, but you will not have the power to achieve that, right? And this is, in fact, nowadays the pathetic display that we are seeing from bunch of second worlders that are just able to bark but not to achieve anything because they are already done for, and they know that because in a few decades they will simply collapse demographically, right? At least the West sits over a pile of gold and of attractive capacity that will mitigate the demographic collapse. Those other systems are desperate because they do not have any break for that. Right, they're simply going to change, and they're going to change brutally because the inferior cultures always have this kind of, say, rapid glimpse, and then they eventually collapse worse than they were before. And this was happening over and over and over again. This is why in the West you still had, after all, such collapse, but a robust structure would remain for the entire, we're talking about the East as well, I'm talking about most of the Mediterranean, would maintain its own primacy throughout the entire millennium, right? So on a large measure, also thanks to, of course, the predisposition, not much just, of course, the legacy, right, of the empire, but knowing what that empire had been and why things would keep working there, essentially, even after the moments of greatest trauma and break and disaster, right, that were never quite so disastrous, like compared to the places that had never quite had even the chance to be something different from a disaster by themselves. And that's the reason also why the migration era occurred in the first place, because everybody, of course, wanted to live in the better places. And the rest wouldn't really have an increase corresponding to the decline of the bigger civilization. So this is valid all throughout history. Whoever wants to bury civilization will get crushed under its rubble. Anyway, right? And again, this is what Marxism teaches, what self-sabotaging is, what the, social envy, like the entire idea of destroying tradition, civilization, the superiority of imperial power derives from self-hatred, from the understanding that you have not been able, right? Not just you have not been able, but you have never even come close to be able to afford to become as powerful. And that's why you want to destroy yourself together with all the rest. So Cassiodorus' words are enlightening regarding the properly the awareness of this civilizational dimension. It is to say that we're reflecting on the fact that, again, with the historiographical means of the time, the things had been different in the past. They were already, and this, of course, exemplifies the same gradual change that had occurred. There had been big events, right? Think about the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410, or the Vandals. The same threat that Attila the Hun had posed in 452 to the same peninsula. Right, but again, as we'll see now, these systems had remained intact. There hadn't been major destructions. There had been major, even the sacks of Rome had been, especially the Visigothic one, had been quite orderly and somehow respectful of imperial authority. And even the Vandalic one, it's been somehow exaggerated, even though lots of stuff. I made a video about the Vandalic sack of Rome, and that's where the greatest amount of riches was sent to Africa. Then there is an interesting story behind that, because when Belisarius conquered the Vandals, some of that stuff went to Constantinople, right? Not back to Rome. Some thing to Jerusalem, such as the Jewish menorah that had been brought by victorious Romans to the Europe as a spoil. And so there are lots of legions stemming from, let's say, the debate on where is also so much of the ancient civilization kind of treasures, and how they have been sadly lost to this point most, but what kind of path they followed at some point. And speaking of Africa, the Vandals had especially posed an important pain in the neck, to say else, to the Italian peninsula, because historically, just like Constantinople drew its grain supplies from Egypt, and also Rome had been, however, Italy had drawn it mostly, and for a longer time, from Africa, in part also from Sardinia and Sicily, but at this point, all these lands, in fact, were under the control of Vandal piracy, and were de facto dictating a bit especially the agrarian import policy in the peninsula. The Vandals, as we were saying before, had made Majorianus' project of Iberian reconquest shipwreck, even though it had been accomplished. The Visigoths surrendered, said, okay, do whatever you want with us, relocate us wherever in the empire, will not give problem. The Eastern Romans had sent a massive fleet to destroy the Vandals, that were, however, able to crush the imperial ships at the Battle of Cape Bon. So this, under the leader of such one of the greatest leaders of migration era, Gaiseric, right? That is, I think, after, of course, Clovis, Theodoric, is and Alaric, let's say, is at least one of the in the latter phase, the greatest commander, the greatest leader, and monarch of the period. Reason for which also the economy, I don't know, for example, Italy imported African pottery that would remain. I made a video, I think, last autumn about this, the most exported, together with Syrian one, pottery in Mediterranean in the following centuries. Naturally, Italy was largely autonomous, like any other country at the time on its basics, right? But these dynamics show, however, how the centrality of the peninsula had been lost in the empire. Again, Rome was the sole unavoidable center of the entire universe for anyone, and even the people who lived outside of the empire. But mostly the political and strategic dynamics had changed now from a couple of centuries substantially, right? Since the first century, there had been a few Italian emperors, right? Doesn't matter that most of what we call foreign were still essentially Romano-Italic colonists, right? That had settled there in generations before. Think about Marcus Aurelius from southern Spain, or but the problem was that, again, they were part of an aristocracy that now was drawn in the Roman Senate from several provinces that had, because of the same Roman colonization, acquired that kind of nobiliar power with a Romanized aristocracy. The advent of Constantinople, and so what at least they wished there to be the second Rome, from the time of Constantine in the early 4th century, had been, however, the most, say, important, definitely pivotal event in the empire, right? Constantinople Byzantium was refounded practically to become properly the cornerstone of a millenary empire that was based now properly on an Hellenistic rather than a Latin civilization. And that, as such, was also quite different politically, culturally, linguistically. The Byzantine aristocracy was much, for example, lower in extraction. The emperor had much greater control, properly, of the state, of the church, right? The West had remained more feudal in nature, right? There were this bigger, extremely powerful, extremely ancient, extremely noble families that embodied literally the highest peak of, for example, education, right? But that, in this sense, had been eroding central power, because nobility mostly does that, as opposed to the Byzantine world, where the aristocracy, the senators, were drawn also from quite humble backgrounds. They had all kind of a stately, standardized, and somehow condensed, cheapened also education, and they were essentially imperial appointees by a degree. Of course, there were very powerful noblemen in the East too, provided with large latifundia, but the proportion was very different from the West. And exactly in these years, in fact, we have seen it, the Eastern Roman Empire had basically suffered the same identical problems the West had. The Huns, the Federati, there were sometimes even worse problems than the West had. But at least, given that Constantinople was also properly the gateway between Europe and Asia, it even blocked banally, the military movements of peoples. There wasn't quite a truly decentralized frontier, if not the Balkans, that arguably, yes, were very close to the capital, but in this sense, the latter forming really a bulwark, immediate bulwark to that. The the Eastern Roman Empire had managed to fundamentally solve the problems without losing chunks of empire. Right, again, most of this derived from the pre-existing kind of Hellenic coastal hardcore center that was somehow different from even, again, the Balkans could be left to the Federati without too much problems and without too much threat of kind of civilizational competition or properly of political and territorial competition. While in the West, the thing had been different, where some chunks of gold, once the Federati had settled there, were properly not to be recovered because the effort from a single center, from a single country of one of the provinces of the world was excessive. Right? Again, Spain, as we've seen, could be reconquered from Italy, but again, there could be a third player that could come in the way and say, okay, let's stop this, right? It'll just be the cornerstone here that doesn't break, right? Again, Gaiseric made that. Had there been another Vandalic king, things would have gone very differently. But that's still a testament of how, even in that case, a cornerstone like Roman Africa, that was one of the most overbearingly Romanized countries in the entire empire, could serve to the successful continental and maritime power at the time to even keep in check an important amount of Italian traffics and so on. So I will not digress now on the differences between the West and the East further as such, because naturally, we're talking about two very different worlds. You know that I thoroughly hate the concept that there ever were properly a Western and an Eastern Roman Empire, two different empires, as a matter of fact, because the empire was always one. Nobody ever thought, even remotely, that there were two empires, because objectively it was not true. But there were two different governments. These were different countries as a whole, and the empire had always been like that. And significantly, the Western and the Eastern Mediterranean, again, had been divided by properly different spiritual forces, different cultures, languages, and dynamics that at this point could not be, were actually reinforcing within their own identity, right? Identities in the late antiquity actually played a greater role than had been the case before. We tend to underestimate how much, for example, the Italic or Italian centrality was felt as in a sort of feudal hierarchy, properly in the imperial concept of these people having managed to tame all the rest of the world. But it's exactly the wave that started from there that, as we've seen, had significantly Romanized, especially the West, where, again, Iberian Gaul began to speak Romance and had, in fact, been part of a system that was much more, that could be felt, universally speaking, as Namatianus would talk about, that Rome had made of a city of the world, right? Because Rome literally had colonized by creating little Romes everywhere in the empire. In the East, this had not been done because there had always been cities from quite a while, at least, that had another identity, a different, properly urban culture, another relation with properly with power, so much that Augustus could be depicted as a pharaoh in Egypt, while in Rome was just, a primus inter pares. So that tells you how big the divide really between West and East was. But naturally, in times of crisis, the reinjection, you can see it from the renewed ethnographic interest toward the barbarian as such, of all these various peoples of different nationalities, the fragmentation of the empire in different chunks with different governments that wanted to autonomize, decentralize themselves. Of course, identities had grown in importance, and these various chunks of empire were reinforcing themselves even in a further kind of national picture. Not always. It depends, right? At least the single most Romanized areas, like, I don't know, southern Spain or central southern Italy or some, I don't know. Even the Byzantine world is mostly, even a bit more of an Asian, actually, than a European thing, because, Constantinople was much more akin to Western Asia Minor rather than the Peloponnese, right? Where nobody was ever particularly happy that there was a Constantinople ruling from or closing the philosophers' schools of Athens or so on. Of course, that is in Attica, not in Peloponnese, but you understand what I mean as Hellas, as a broader concept. So you cannot make the equation simply Byzantine equates Greek unless you, of course, understand that Greek in that context at least meant something wider. And we're talking about Hellenism, so not necessarily even just something Hellenic per se, even though that was an element of Byzantine culture, one of the most important ones. So the 5th century had been a turning point, especially for Italy, because, as I often say, just in 60 years everything changed. From the sack of Rome in 410 to the deposition of Romulus Augustus. There are just some, 2 or 3 generations, right? And at the beginning of the 5th century, again, nobody in the West thought oh my God, we're in crisis. The Western half will end. There will be peoples settling here and there without control, right? Everything had been somehow played also easily. Like the Visigoths were essentially a Roman army that mutinied and was simply settled in Aquitaine later on because there was no other way to content them. But as you know from the story, up to a few years before, Stilicho had on multiple occasions simply cornered the Visigoths, and he could have wiped them out, but he preferred to use them as political pawns, right? And in the meanwhile, there were still much larger armies in the empire fighting against one another than anything that these federati could put together. So that in spite of 406, so when a multitude of peoples entered Gaul, swarming into it, reaching Spain and creating lots of problems with the Vandals, in fact settling in Africa and managing to sack Rome in 455, and then the compaction of those who had remained out under Attila, and so kind of the polarization of the conflictuality between the empire and this kind of strange thing that basically collapsed almost immediately after the death of Attila later on, without leaving trace. The core lands of the empire had remained intact. Doesn't matter whether the Vandals had settled in Africa, if also such a Romanized land like Aquitaine, at least the southern part, the one from the Mediterranean watershed, was in the hand of the Visigoths. These lands remained central to the dominations of these peoples. They were substantially Roman. We made lots of videos about, in fact, some of the Visigothic and Burgundian law that shows some of the highest degree of Romanization with a de facto parallel kind of Roman law within the say, next to the Germanic one. It could be interchangeable for the subjects. The fact also that, for example, the Visigoths would take a long time even to have a direct control from the Central Iberian Plateau on a place like Baetica / Andalusia, right? And again, as we will see now, Italy represented one of the greatest examples of this, because its unity had not been disrupted, right? In Gaul, you have different peoples that settle in different places. You have the Franks, you have the Alemanni, you have the Visigoths. In Spain, too, the situation is complicated. There are the Suebi, etc. In Africa, Africa is smaller, at least territorial. You have Vandals there unitarily, but it's not as big as Italy, that is an entire chunk where there is no people that has basically just one part of it, whatever. No, right? At this point, there is a Roman government with essentially a foreign army of some sort, which is not a national one. This is important. It's the sum of different nationalities, of federati from different backgrounds that sometimes we can't even reconstruct clearly. In fact, Odoacer, we don't even technically know what kind of ethnicity he was, but that serving in the Roman army, de facto becoming also, in the sense, what had the Roman army barbarized, or had the barbarians Romanized in the Roman army, because that's a significant difference. All these peoples were fundamentally acting also as Roman military commanders, right? Odoacer's father had been a magister militum. You find this pretty much everywhere. Like, they were within the empire, mentally, culturally, conceptually. There wasn't much of aside from personal ambition, any kind of attempt to say, okay, well, now we are something else. If you're moving with an entire people, you are recognized by that people as their ethnic leader. But as far as your relation with Rome is concerned, Alaric was made king by the Romans among the gods, right? As also a magister militum for the Illyricum as well. So this aspect is quite fascinating. And again, still, the centrality of Italy had been maintained by this non-partitioning, right? It wouldn't occur until essentially the Lombards invasion, right? That's where you have actually, even there, still not a dramatic amount of fragmentation, but still, as far as the local culture is concerned, because you can have the Byzantines from one side and Lombards from the other, but de facto it's the same country as well. At least the greatest divide existed between the Po Valley and the rest of the peninsula as such. But that gap would be filled exactly in the following centuries as well, because the Lombards aimed at properly a political, territorial, and national compaction of the peninsula. So these indicators must be very important, because in France you would have, for example, a radical cultural difference between the north and the south that would last till very recent times, right? The idea that throughout the Middle Ages, even though there was technically a whole Western Frankish kingdom at a point, still culturally, nationally, that there were two goals still. And this had much to do, in fact, with the degree of Romanization. The same is true for many countries, right? In some of all the post-Roman countries have this divide as far as the degree of Romanization was entailed. That was the real divide that naturally pre-existed on the base of environmental, cultural, kind of ethnic divides, right? But the way the empire was conceived naturally relied heavily on the functioning of the latent, what we call today, by approximation, the late antique system that was fully operative basically in all the Mediterranean, right? Without any possibility of disruption, right? That even when it happened in the greatest case in Italy after the Gothic War, right, still presented dramatic continuities, especially as far as, again, per capita wealth, urbanization, literacy, etc. was concerned, even in the darkest hours of the moment of the greatest depopulation and so on. So this tells you how resilient and how impactful Romanity had been after all, and how even the decline is always relative to some factors, some indicators, some criteria of evaluation, not just say, well, okay, at some point the West ended, so everything changed, it's another story. No, right? This never happened, and that's not how really history can be understood in any meaningful way. So the worst moment, telling the truth, before the Gothic War in Italy had been the last decades of the emperors of Ravenna, right? After the assassination of Valentinian III, it was essentially the last big Western emperor as far as his personal power was concerned. We have 9 evanescent rulers who, again, by that point had chosen their administrative capital in Ravenna because it was historically basically the seat of the Adriatic fleet. Since Augustan times, it was pretty bulky city surrounded by swamps, so it was very difficult to besiege. And we will see it now also because it took 4 years for the Goths to finally make Odoacer capitulate, and it was considered as a sort of epic thing that also the Longobards wanted to emulate, except there was no siege there of any proportion because simply the country opened the gates to them. But in their historiography, they had to invent that they had besieged Pavia for 3 years because it had to be like Ravenna, right? It never happened. It's an historiographical invention of later authors that had interiorized so much the fact that Theodoric the Great, Dietrich von Bern, right? In the Germanic epos, Theodoric is a huge hero, right? Is one like also Alboin later was Snorri Sturluson talks about. There is a lot of very interesting insight of how the Germans thought of the migration era and how these heroes were seen as, again, having achieved a lot. Naturally, we know a few, considering the level of documentation of those times. Obviously, these were big events, right? Clamorous events, epical events, and full of glory and of, again, especially from the perspective of those who came from Central Europe, from even from the east, especially the Goths, that technically were, I mean, the Visigoths had spent a considerable amount of time in the empire. The Ostrogoths, not so much. They were strongly Romanized by some degree, by comparatively to other Germans, but they had just reacquired their own political strength after having stayed under the Huns for a long time and having had their great kingdom of Crimea destroyed by, in fact, the Hunnic invasions, and that had been the most glorious Germanic achievement up to that point. So now they had the sense of revanchism. They wanted to reacquire the greatest apple, and they did so by coming to rule in Italy, which was again the biggest deal of all. And today we do not talk about the Ostrogothic rule of Italy. Again, I made videos about this, and we will keep talking about that at some point. But naturally, that was the single most positive periods for the peninsula in late antiquity, and far better than the last decades of Ravenate emperors. Another feature, again, of this last period had been the fact that power had been de facto held by a series of non-Roman, or at least not non-ethnically Roman generals, right? These were actually Roman officers, Roman commanders. They were part of the Roman army. They had Roman titles. They sought after them to see their power confirmed, legitimized. They lived in Italy, again, in a fully late antique reality. They were just, however, of barbarian origin. Again, we don't know exactly even some groups where they actually came from. What can sometimes we have very scanning reference, even properly for the groups coming from Central Europe. But there was surely a very direct connection with them. The Hunnic experience, they were mostly of Germanic origin, as you understand. However, they were also coming from another world mentally. We never talked about it so much, right? The idea they were more warlike or more driven, or they had more to win from such a lifestyle, because they were powerful, yes, but again, the country was still ruled by the Roman aristocracy. So even though they controlled the militias and they could influence the political processes. This happened just by appointing a puppet emperor that fundamentally satisfied the aristocracy. That's the game that really happened. They were strong men. Odoacer in 476, as you know, had deposed the young Romulus Augustus, had been proclaimed Rex by the army of Italy, so as to stress the fact that this was properly a ruler on his own, but de facto his policy was designed to content the Roman senators and the Roman church that were, again, fine if there was fundamentally had been fine up to that point if kind of a weaker ruler in Ravenna throttled by these military leaders would just leave them a bit alone in their latifundia, doing whatever they wanted in a privatistic sense, and opposing such aristocracy would have engulfed the country in a mess that, of course, even the Germanic Federati wanted or needed or felt, of course, to be even advantageous to do for what, right? They were already in power after all. They were just living there. Nothing was really happening. There weren't many properly territorial threats, right? So that's where the Ostrogoths actually came to change the picture. Because again, Italy had suffered invasions sometimes from some war bands, from the Alemanni, there had been lots of peoples that had created problems since the time of the Marcomannic Wars, right? The Germans had arrived until Italy, but there had, as we've just seen, not been properly a moment in which the country had been taken over by any people, right? These peoples raided and then came back north of the Alps and stayed there without, even in terms of political and territorial compaction, constituting an equal threat to the Italian government, right? These are, by the way, the years in which Clovis has yet to come to power in the north. That changed the game a big deal, and Theodoric, in fact, would have had to cope with that, as you know, with a very intricate system of alliances, because that really compacted an enormous amount of forces, this huge Atlantic plains in Gaul, coming to crush the Alemanni, the Burgundians, the Goths that basically had to shift their own. I mean, the Visigoths, they shift their center of power south of the Pyrenees. But up to this point, again, it's as if Italy had been just part of this huge kind of Roman world that had not been fundamentally threatened by a substantial military occupation. Again, smaller realities like Africa or Aquitaine and parts of especially northern Iberia, had been somehow being taken over by other peoples. But for the rest, in spite of the general, let's say, the erosion of public power and collapse of the administrative system, no other wedge had entered, right, this world prepotently, violently, whatever, and everything was somehow managed to keep things more or less as they were. Like, it's like with the Vandals. The same Odoacer, when coming to power, acquiesced, for example, to the Vandal control of Sicily, the Visigothic influence in Provence under Euric. So he was just content with his own world, right? Also, you know that the empire had, since the Tetrarchy, had been divided in some forts, right? Italy had embodied the second westernmost, and so it controlled latitudinally all the peninsula, then Africa, that now, as we've seen, had been lost. But at this point, from Ravenna, the emperors controlled all of what is essentially on the right bank of the Danube. So basically all of today's, probably southern Germany, Austria, parts of, Croatia, Hungary, Serbia, right up to Singidunum, Sirmium, Viminatum, that areas that the Gepids had not even managed to strip from them. Even in this alleged phase of decline. In fact, the same Ostrogoths under Vitiges, when those centers on the Danube were threatened, he sent an army to the Balkans, crushed the Gepids, and said, this belongs to us, as de facto kings of Italy. So that from there, right, that territorial dimension was deeply felt still, and that speaks of the integrity, after all, of the right of much still of the political control of the administration. Right, the greatest advantage of such Germanic migrations is that they would bring with them new, precious, fresh demographic resources. They were not such huge groups. The Ostrogoths were actually some of the largest, but we're talking about at best some tens of thousands of warriors, and then I don't know, twice, thrice the same amount of population at most, with the elderly, the women, the children. And this ethnic bulk of warriors would make up the army as such. So there was an increased also territorial control thanks to that. A bit less interesting for them were the lands in the north, in places like Russia or the Noricum, at least at the time of Odoacer. For Theodoric, those would become quite important instead, because they were somehow depressed areas. But that's where, for example, Theodoric settled the crushed Alemanni that had withdrawn as refugees in this kind of Ostrogothic-dominated lands after the Battle of Tolbiac against Clovis. There was a deep connection between Ostrogothic Italy and properly Central Europe as pagan Germany, for example. The Thuringians were very close to the gods. Lots of other pagan people sided with the Christian Aryan gods because they wanted to not to fall either in the Merovingian or in the Byzantine sphere of influence, interestingly enough. Also, the Longobards were remotely connected to that system, as they would have also eventually sided with the Byzantines during the Gothic War, sending troops in Italy where they were just starting the place where they would have migrated en masse in eventually. So it's a very interesting time in history. I began medieval history studying exactly this period, and I realized we must make many more videos about the migration era, because it's really a big thing. Right? Aside from the main movements, the peoples, whatever, you realize all these political issues that make you realize also how intertwined Europe was already at that time, right? And how much, in this sense, also the legacy of the empire meant for these other populations outside, what had been the directly controlled, at least Roman world, and for them to be part of the same, right? And there are also these outliving experiences. For example, when Romulus Augustus was deposed by Odoacer, being eventually only in a historiographical sense being attributed the diminutive Augustulus to highlight the fact that the empire had, at least not properly, but at least that had been represented properly under Augustus, another Augustus, the true Augustus. And this was a little Augustus, also because he was young at the time. And you would say, well, what happened to him? Well, he actually was sent by Odoacer to the Castellum Lucullanum. It was a villa near Naples, where Romulus, and also the name Romulus as the founder of Rome, of course, was meaningful there, may have been alive by still, for a substantial amount during the 6th century. So after all, as the last emperor of Rome, ideally, right, at least from a Western perspective, you would have spent the rest of your life in a villa in Campania, like, blessed by the weather and then, and the Campania Felix, the fertility of the area, and just having fun, supposedly. Maybe not excessively, but still in a context, again, that had not collapsed, and that he wouldn't see the end of, right? He wouldn't live enough likely to see the Gothic Wars. Surely, however, it was surely a blow to see, for a Roman, a country taken over for the first time by barbarians, fully, right? The Goths, again, kept ruling, together with the Roman aristocracy that was represented in equal terms in Theodoric's Ravenate consistorium, which means that literally there were at the same table, from one side the Goths and the other side the Romans, and they administered the empire like that. The Goths controlled the army, the Romans controlled, let's say, the civil administration, if we can speak of such a thing, because the divide between military and civilian was not really what we intend today, but they worked shoulder to shoulder. Also because, of course, the Gothic army was supplied by the Roman latifundia, was armed by the Fabrici, especially in the north. The Goths were settled in all the most strategic areas of the peninsula, mostly along the Apennine and in the Po Valley, controlling the Alpine passes. So it was a compact, somehow functional system. Again, it was surely the peak of Romano-Germanic cooperation, integration, and generally speaking, also of political power, because the Ostrogothic system that managed to ransom Sicily from the Vandals that invaded Provence and created all this kind of Illyrian, Norian belt and alliances with the rest of the world was surely one of the highest peaks of Germanic power. Just the Merovingians fundamentally would be more than that, right? And the reason chiefly being that, in spite of all, they converted straight to Catholicism from paganism without passing through Arianism. Instead, the Goths, both in Italy and in Spain, and the Vandals in Africa, had this problem that for a while they had to keep maintaining this Arian thing, because at least there were some groups within them that would see it as a chance to take out the other ones for a while. It wasn't that they didn't care absolutely anything about the theological issues. I mean, they did, of course, in as much they had an imperfect understanding of the Nicene Creed, but this doesn't mean that the Catholic party was more theologically correct, among the individuals than the Arian one. It was just a very subtle, intelligent, rational political game that, however, ended up on the longer run to disrupt the stability of these countries and to, in fact, expose them even to the Byzantine reconquest, because that's what eventually happened. So it would be very interesting to think what would have happened if these people, if the Goths had been Catholic since the beginning, right? Surely they would have accomplished more. And I made a video on how the Merovingians outstripped the hegemony on Western Europe from the Goths, exactly for this reason. So, as we were saying before, what did happen in 476? Nothing. Absolutely nothing, right? This date has been, as you know, paraded by modern historians. Oh my god, 476. The Roman Empire fell. Oh my god, the Western one at least. Everything changed. The Dark Ages began. If you had asked a guy, a random, I don't know, colonist in some Italian latifundium, would say, what happened this year? I said, what? That nothing, of course. Nothing happened. What did happen? Because they didn't properly, nothing happened. Right? This is the point. Nothing changed. Right? We remember the date because Odoacer rendered back the imperial insignia of the West to Constantinople, to Emperor Zeno, which was a political move to say, look, we respect your own authority, let us stay here, right? And there is no need to perpetuate this buffonade of, electing yet another puppet emperor that is going to end killed by us anyway. So the aristocracy here is Roman. We recognize, the imperial power to the Eastern Emperor, which is an interesting, flattering way of putting it. Just prop us with some kind of further Roman title to rule over Italy, and everything is going to be fine for the both of us, right? That was objectively fine. It was fine for mostly for Italy, because again the decision had been taken from there. As we will see now, however, Constantinople didn't fully appreciate the thing, because of course it was very important to have basically deprived the West of a legitimacy claim on imperial titles. Objectively, up to that point, there hadn't been major problems between East and West. I mean, they had been supporting each other fundamentally. There may have been some kind of unresolved questions, especially in Illyria, where the Eastern Romans had kept to control some territories that had historically been, pertaining to the West, but they had never quite gone against one another. They had mostly tried to, yes, they kicked the Visigoths back and forth from both sides of the court, and say, but and of course they acted in pretty cynical ways with one another. But overall, right, if, for example, in the aforementioned Battle of Cape Bon, the Vandals had been destroyed, Africa would have been rendered by the Easterners to the Westerners, right? The Byzantines would have not occupied it and said, okay, now we take it from the West. Everything would have been aimed to a sort of recompaction, also because from a political or dynastic point of view, given also the relative flexibility and ambiguity that the Roman successory system afforded, could make its rulers afford, I don't know, there may have been some kind of recompaction at some point, as it had happened under Theodosius, right, and with his descendants and so on. So, technically speaking, that was the least of the problems, right? The greater problem, however, was now that if the West remained without a local emperor, naturally could take more disgregative directions. What did the Easterners do? Right, when Zeno received a senatorial embassy from the West in Constantinople, the same Roman ambassadors said, look, we don't really need a new emperor. We're fine like this, which was a way to say, we know that you're powerful. We know that you could militarily intervene in Italy even. Right, but technically nothing happened. There has not been an invasion. There has not been any change. So this is just a favor that we institutionally do to you to render back the imperial insignia to Constantinople. So that Zeno responded by making Odoacer a patrician. It was a way to just tie again further the Italian government to his authority. Also, accepted the nomination of a consul. One of the two consuls will continue to be appointed annually, which also the Byzantines kept making every year, because again the emperor had a control on that. So, as you understand, even the system of the magistracies in Rome kept working as it had been doing forever. And all this was done, again, with greater care for keeping the Roman Senate and Church cool than contenting just Odoacer, that was just a leader like any other. So that an order was somehow maintained. There is an essential continuity during this period, right? Odoacer, as we've seen, wisely didn't push the thing. He was pretty conciliatory towards the Senate. This thing would be continued. The first thing that Theodoric does when he conquers Ravenna is to go to Rome to render homage to the papacy and to the Senate. So the idea that Romanity there couldn't be touched, couldn't be altered, right? The system was useful if it was run the way it had always been run, was omnipresent. In 483, the Praetorian prefect Basilius, acting on Zeno's behalf, was involved in the election of Pope Felix III, which is an important change in ecclesiastical history because this was a pope chosen from the aristocracy as well. Up to that point, the Church of Rome had maintained some important communitary standards for which it had been not necessarily antagonistic towards the imperial rule, given that at this point Christianity was also the official religion of the empire, but that had said, okay, we are the church and we manage the things internally. At this point, instead, the power of the aristocracy was such, even properly in the city of Rome, that the church began to kind of blend in more properly with the senatorial aristocracy, and Felix III came exactly from this background. And it would go on like this historically. Think about Gregory the Great, that came from the gens Anicia, one of the most brutally noble families in the entire empire. So there is properly again a fusion. This happens also in Gaul. It happens in Spain, right? There is general marriage of the lay aristocracy in those countries, especially the Germanic one and the ecclesiastical one, the bishops, that have also stemmed now from senatorial families of Roman background. So everything was, as I was saying before, tending towards a more, I'd say, a regionalization of power, so that the Church of Rome now had a significant power, as was conceived at the time, because there was no, Rome had a primacy, ecclesiastically speaking, all over Christendom, for obvious reasons, and as the place of martyrdom of Peter and Paul and whatever. But the idea still is that every bishop and archbishop was meant to rule just his own community, right? We have to wait a half of a millennium before the papal monarchy is fully, laid out after, especially the Gregorian reforms. However, it was evident already from that point that not only Rome had a universal breadth of spiritual prestige that was coming to encompass all the West, also because the church was very much developed also in places like Gaul, etc. So there was always a deep connection within all these rulers, and especially again with the Franks would have arrived to be directly Catholic, so not Arians, because again Arianism was tolerated in all this, right? Most Germans of the army were Arians, generally speaking, or were not still somehow pagan, right? And as long as the thing didn't take institutional character, nobody really cared. The important was that the aristocracy was fully Catholic, and that's the only thing that mattered politically. However, the papacy was also taking on properly a regional, properly Italian character, right? The idea that Rome now was fundamentally under a unitary control from another, in fact, an Italian city. It wasn't Rome, but Rome still was also broadly speaking, the center of that imperial idea that laid under this kind of governments in the first place, that the power of the church became one with those who wanted to rule in the peninsula. Right? Odoacer spent himself particularly for Rome. For example, he refurbished the Colosseum, where the front seats were allocated to the senators, and there are still the inscriptions there from late antiquity with the various names of the various places. This tells you how much reverence existed towards the city, towards its aristocracy, and so hardly the oppression of a terrible world where the West had fallen and everything was going down and terrible things happening. On the contrary, it was actually a quite successful cooperation. The Senate was given the right to mint bronze coins too, right? So that the rabbinate government was in part also delegating some functions properly to the city of Rome within the peninsula. And it is clear that the effective monopoly over some posts which the leading senatorial families had held during the 5th century was to continue, and that the rabbinate government was guaranteeing that. So when Romulus Augustus was deposed, Odoacer began to rule. There was hardly any significant change in Italy. What came to change this picture were the Ostrogoths. So as we've seen, Odoacer hadn't been properly even concerned with too much Provence, Noricum, Sicily. The important was to maintain power in the Italian heartland, on the Italian peninsula. This, however, was still a proof of some weakness. Again, after Majoranus, the neighbors had understood that still this large space could be partially penetrated, right? If it wasn't close to properly to the heartland, right? Sicily or Provence weren't big centers of power. There were rich areas, they were deeply Romanized, but that was pretty much it. They didn't have a central, right? They weren't states centrally recognized and having an army, whatever. They were small. They were provinces fundamentally, not countries as well as regional powers. What came to change the system decisively, however, also considering the say Odoacer's lack of interest in this kind of frontier areas, showing that Italy didn't have enough power just to reclaim them, and thus probably not very much internally, was to send Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, to overthrow Odoacer and to rule Italy on Constantinople's behalf. Why? Well, the Ostrogoths had been a problem for the Byzantines. Theodoric had gone as far as threatening the same Constantinople. He had been risen in the same capital because he had spent 10 years of his youth there as a hostage. So he understood how the Roman Empire worked pretty well. He had been at the head, again, from the Amali clan of this group of peoples, again hegemonized by the so-called, what would be called just in Italy, the Ostrogoths, right? Because then they were the Goths, and mostly it was these local clans that made a real ethnic identity. And there were lots of other, let's say, elements there. There were Sarmatians, Turks, Slavs, also Romanized population of some sort, next to the Germanic core. And there were, again, a pretty large people that had settled now after the disgregation of the Hunnic Empire in the Illyricum on the Danube, which again was being a looming threat on Constantinople herself. So they were to be gotten rid of by Constantinople, and the idea of sending them to Italy to let's say reinforce the sense of dependency from the east of this country. So with some federati that would act as a sort of conquerors on behalf of the same Byzantines seemed a good idea, besides, of course, the sheer advantage deriving from getting rid of this kind of probably 100,000 people from the Balkans that were constantly threatening Greece and some other of the productive lands of the empire. This is how Theodoric accepted also as a good opportunity, because he would have had to fight against Odoacer and things could have gone differently. But what was to gain from the rule of the Italian peninsula was much greater than the risk. So in 488, Theodoric set out from the old military town of Nove, near the modern Svistov in Bulgaria, and moved together with his forces, again, that had an important degree also of Romanization, militarily wise. Again, these troops were mostly maintaining themselves on the same base of which a Roman field army would do in a given region, right? They had been imperial soldiers. They came naturally from a different background, ethnically speaking, but they knew their deal, their type of warfare from Central Europe, the Eastern Europe, the steppes, but they somehow were orderly enough to carry out a major movement successfully, having a very specific political objectives, carrying out an adequate strategy, right? And these were people, by the way, that had been fighting also against the same imperial forces at some point, right? After having freed themselves from the Huns, but these were still peoples that had historically been fighting against the Roman army, right? Still, they had that experience. Again, Constantinople had been even threatened by them, so they were a mix, right, culturally, in terms of military culture between the two systems. They knew how to cope against also a urbanized theater, etc. There were surely other war bands that joined Theodoric in all this movement, because it was an opportunity. Like the more punching the internal core was, the higher in specific weight it was, and the more successful it could be. Right, some elements were also difficult to discipline, but Theodoric was a very charismatic leader. He knew his deal, and he knew perfectly well that, just like Odoacer and Zeno, that for controlling Italy, you had first of all to respect the local establishment, right? And Odoacer was a more wavering figure. Again, wasn't at the head of another compact national ethnic people that had settled organically. No, he was just the product of this constant kind of degeneration of the Western imperial system at the head of a mixed of a group of mixed ethnicities, war bands, troops from different places that didn't probably have much of a cohesion, even though probably the standards of the Italian army were good. Like, as long as there was at least a functional state, the Roman army remained substantially capable of, pretty impressive feats. As we've seen, up to the 60s, it could even go grab another region. So at least for defending the country at this point, it could have been dangerous, and discipline, unity of command, and determination were required. Women and children, as we were saying, were among the members of what clearly also migration together with a military expedition. So the fate of the entire people depended on the success of this movement. There were ways, right, to kind of bail out at a certain point, to come back in case of failure, maintaining a certain political unity in the process. However, that would have still endangered the future of the group politically, and Theodoric was invading Italy to win, right? So Odoacer's forces, even if they weren't particularly motivated or cohesive, or even loyal, right, to their leader, considering that when Odoacer moved them to the Isonzo River at the boundaries with the Illyricum, these forces fled without giving battle, right? They fell back to Verona. That was one of the largest cities in the empire at the time, fortified and so on. However, Odoacer was defeated by the Ostrogoths in battle, and was obliged to retreat as far as his capital, Ravenna. As we've seen, Ravenna's defenses were impressive, so that there was no other way for the Ostrogoths but to lay siege to the city for a long time, right? This siege went on for years, during which naturally the Ostrogoths concentrated enough forces around the center, but began to take control of at least parts of Italy, especially in the north, from which they could draw the resources to keep their army supplied. And hard-pressed, Odoacer, after 3 years of siege, entered into negotiations with Theodoric in February 493, and famously or infamously enough, when Theodoric agreed to not just to negotiate, but apparently even to share the government of the peninsula, when inviting his colleague to a banquet, slaughtered him, right, passed him side to side with his sword, thus inaugurating bloodily his what would be actually an enlightened as long reign in Italy between 493, in fact, and 526, right? Odoacer was at that point just done, given that he hadn't been able to mobilize the decisive moral support of the peninsula in his favor. And the papacy, the Roman nobility, was to receive, again, Theodoric's respect to rule over the country, that, again, would leave in these 30 years one of the most prosperous phases in late antiquity. Also, however, the last, before, in fact, the Gothic War, that is more correctly actually the Byzantine reconquest, the fact that, of course, Constantinople was not satisfied with having gotten rid of the Ostrogoths from from the Balkans and having sent them to Italy, but they wanted to reconquer Italy as a whole, together with Africa, They had their reasons. They feared at that point the Merovingians. They realized that the Goths were divided, at least after Theodoric's reign, or at least in the last years of his reign. Great part of Ostrogothic power was declining, for reasons we'll explain in another video. However, in insight, like when we talk about the end of late antiquity in the Italian peninsula, this has to do with, yes, specifically the Gothic destructions, not the Byzantine ones, because Totila carried out, as you know, a scorched earth strategy that razed to the ground an important part of the country, but it was the only way for it to hope for the same country that at that point sided mostly with at least in the masses with the Goths, to resist the Byzantine reconquest. It would have still maintained the latifundia holders in place, except this war that saw the armies making back and forth twice or thrice all across the latitude of the Apennine Peninsula destroyed the same latifundia system and paved the way for a more radical change that was exploited by the Longobards, but fundamentally won the support, like properly of the Italian peasantry, and managed to significantly undermine properly the Byzantine presence in the peninsula, and creating actually a much more compact government, properly all one, even there with the without the previous German-Roman division that had existed in Gothic times, properly creating a national kingdom that would last, and at least until the Carolingian conquest, that, as we've seen, however, made of this kingdom the center properly of the imperial requirements, let's say, for the rest of his possessions, and took in fact the crown off differently from any other people conquered by the Carolingians that were all, say, downgraded institutionally within the empire. So the history of this period is actually much more ideologically connected with what would go on in the land later on. And that was always connected with the imperial legacy of Rome, right? We will see these things step by step in another video. They're not particularly easy to discuss in a short time. However, for today, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.